Hi everybody, my name is Jory Stillman. I am a master certified coach with the International Coaching Federation. I've been coaching for over 15 years, and in addition to coaching, I mentor coaches, I train coaches, I do all sorts of coaching related things, and I'm a mental health and executive coach. I'm here today to talk about thinking traps, and thinking traps come from the field of cognitive behavioral therapy, but here we're going to be using them in a coaching context. So, what are thinking traps? Thinking traps are otherwise known as cognitive distortions. They're exaggerated or irrational negative thought patterns, internal mental filters or biases, and they impact our emotions and behaviors. So our brains are constantly processing information, and to deal with this, they seek shortcuts that reduce our mental burden. And sometimes these shortcuts are helpful, and other times they can cause more harm than good. They can be insidious, they're subtle, and they're difficult to recognize when they're a regular feature of our day-to-day thoughts. So that's why they can be so damaging, and it's hard to change when you don't recognize as something that needs to change. So I'm also here, and I would love to hear from you, even before I go forward, if you've heard of thinking traps, or if you've heard of cognitive distortions. Please feel free to put that in the chat. I am going to talk about next Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties, and P.S. this is my very first time doing live, so hopefully it will get better. So our minds can be wonderful and creative playgrounds where we visualize, we ponder, and we solve problems, but our minds can also cause suffering, as you know. If you're human, our thoughts can drive us crazy, and like I said, we fall into what are commonly called thinking traps. These are patterns of thinking that can cause distress, feelings of anxiety, and even depression. And in a coaching context, we can help ourselves to kind of learn to coach ourselves into identifying and challenging these thinking traps. So I'm just going to share a few different thinking traps and some common examples of these thinking traps. And while I'm sharing these thinking traps, I invite you to think about which ones you might recognize in yourself. How can you start listening for thinking traps in yourself? And I'll tell you the truth is that once you start recognizing them in yourself, you're also going to start hearing them wherever you go, whether that's friends or families or colleagues. So we're identifying and then challenging our thinking traps, which is going to contribute to increased self-awareness of our triggers, our thought patterns, and the impact that they have on our actions. So basically, we have a thought, it impacts how we feel and how we behave, and it's a loop. It's not a panacea, but it's part of the whole process. So one that everybody is familiar with is should. You should do this, you should do that. I should be this, I should be that. If I did this, I should feel differently than I feel. That's a common one. In fact, today I had a client who is an early childhood educator, and she was beating herself up over the fact that she wasn't able to regulate her emotions. Well, she's regulating her emotions, but she wasn't able to internally regulate her emotions. Externally, she was good, and she was judging herself. I shouldn't feel this way. This is, I love this work. I should be able to manage myself better. And so, just bringing that awareness of should, that she has such a strong should, sort of sparked something in her. And inviting the word, instead of should, I could. So taking the pressure off in that way. So thinking about if you, quote unquote, should all over yourself, and just start noticing how many times you're doing that. That's like a very, very common thinking trap. Another one is all or nothing or polarized thinking, black and white thinking, right? So That might sound like, I hate my boss, I hate my new role, and now I have to leave this role, right? So instead of having nuance, everything is either good or bad, which is also very, very, very limiting. And one would want to ask themselves, okay, it doesn't have to be all good or all bad, but what is a possibility that lies in between? So you kind of want to be onto yourself when you hear yourself using this emphatic language, like, I will never get ahead, or nobody will ever like me. And really challenge yourself. Really? Is that true? Will you never get ahead? Softening it. But just starting to recognize if you fall into the black and white pattern of all or nothing thinking. Another example might be, if I'm not successful at everything I do, I'm a complete failure, right? So this person, maybe it's yourself, is often also struggling with perfectionism. And they think of everything they do in terms of success or failure, and then becoming preoccupied with avoiding failure at all costs, and becomes unrealistic, or they overwork themselves to achieve success. So that's that. Mind reading is a very, very common one. Assuming you know what another person is thinking, right? So, for example, somebody goes out to lunch with a friend, and then she shares that she has decided to take time off of work because she's been feeling completely exhausted. And, the friend just sort of goes, sure, but doesn't ask any follow-up questions. And immediately the friend jumps to the conclusion that my friend thinks I'm weak, or she thinks I'm pathetic, that I have to take off time from work. Whereas she might not have been thinking anything at all. She's just really being present and listening. So it's really, mind reading is assuming what another person is thinking, jumping to a conclusion about what it is that they're thinking. And when we start to sort of do this, it impacts, again, how we feel, and maybe how we feel. Like, we'll start feeling sad, down, anxious, and then perhaps how we behave. Maybe we don't call that person back, or we suddenly go silent. Another common one is somebody doesn't get a text back, and they immediately jump to the conclusion that that person doesn't like them. So that's assuming you know what the other person is thinking. And this is very common, by the way, how texting stresses people out. When people don't text somebody right away, they immediately jump to that conclusion. Another example is, this is similar, jumping to conclusions or fortune telling. So an example of that would be, you have a date with a wonderful person, right? Or you're hopeful, but right away you predict that it'll go bad. Again, making assumptions about how the date will go before it even occurs. And it might be based on actually zero evidence. You have no evidence that this will go bad, but perhaps from past experience, that's influencing. But we want to catch ourselves when we're fortune telling, thinking we know what will happen in the future. And of course, again, I want to say that some of these thought patterns can be helpful. It's when they're we over-index on them, or when our thoughts are causing us anxiety or stress or worry, that we want to check in. Okay, well, what am I thinking? How is what I'm thinking impacting how I'm feeling? Another great example is, before even sending a resume, despite having all the qualifications, you predict that you won't get the job, or that you'll mess up the interview. So again, noticing, becoming aware, not judging yourself for having this, just starting to be aware. Overgeneralization is another thinking trap. You generalize and see a pattern from a single event. Some keywords: always, never, all of them, none of them, everybody, nobody, right? It's overgeneralization is when you conclude that a single event is actually part of a series of unending negative events. So we want to be listening to ourselves. Are we saying words like always, that always happens? or that will never happen, or all the people think this, or they all feel that, or none of the people think that. So again, some of these are similar, right? Black and white thinking. It's not helpful thinking because it can't possibly take all thinking into account. Sometimes we make mistakes, but we don't always make mistakes, right? So you may hear yourself say something, again, I always make mistakes in job interviews, or, something like that. So I'm going to keep moving through because unfortunately there are a lot of ways that humans do thinking, have, cognitive distortions or thinking traps. One is very common, magnification or catastrophic thinking, expecting the worst and blowing things way out of proportion. Again, going back to the job interview, even though you have been preparing for days and know all of the information, you just know that you'll be nervous, know that your thoughts will be mixed up. And you'll say, I'll forget what I know and I won't be able to answer all the questions. I'll make a fool of myself. I'll be so embarrassed and then I won't get a job, right? It's this spiral of catastrophic thinking. How do you feel at the end of this catastrophe? Well, like it was a catastrophe. So not only is this person engaging in catastrophic thinking, but she's fortune telling and mind reading at the same time. And she has worked herself up into a frenzy of angst. Another example, we could call her Sue. She has a first date and he's running late. And immediately Sue assumes the worst. Her worries rapidly escalate and thoughts become exaggerated, and where there could be so many reasonable explanations about why the person is late. And by the time the person's date arrives, she's already imagined that the person either A, stood them up, B, got in a horrible accident, or C, any other possible disaster has befallen them. So how does that leave her feeling? Not so good. Minimization is the opposite of magnification. This cognitive distortion consists of minimizing positive experiences. The magnitude of importance for positive qualities is diminished when this distortion occurs. This might sound like, for example, you've been working on your master's degree or an undergraduate degree, and you finally receive that degree, and all you can focus on is, maybe the one grade that you didn't do as well in, or you've written an excellent paper, and you got an A minus, right? Whatever, something like that. And all you're looking at is for the negative feedback that you've gotten. Your mind is overtaken by this. And so, if you were to congratulate somebody like that, or even yourself, you might hear them say, meh, it's no big deal. Anyone could have done it. Or they just wanted me to be done already, right? So really minimizing. And in this case, we would want to stop, not minimize, acknowledge, show ourselves acknowledgement, show ourselves gratitude, really acknowledge what has gone on. Another example of minimization is a story, right? I'm just going to tell a little story about a guy named Tom who has to give a speech at his sister's wedding. And when it comes time to make this toast, he stumbles over a few of the words. He quickly regains control, and the rest of the speech was moving and heartfelt, and he received so many compliments on his speech. However, Thomas cannot receive praise, right? He cannot receive. And he complains that he was embarrassed by his slip-ups, and he felt he'd ultimately ruined his sister's special day. So he's really magnifying the slip-ups, and he's also minimizing the rest of the loving and sincere speech. If he was thinking more realistically, he would recognize that most people don't even notice his blunders and enjoyed his speech. And maybe the mistakes even made his toast sound more genuine and sincere. So this is a really good example of that. Emotional reasoning is when one accepts their emotions as fact. So a simple way of saying this is, I feel it, therefore it's true. However, just because we feel something doesn't mean it's true, right? Feelings are real, but they're not reality. We need to acknowledge them, feel them, allow them to be, and also know that just because I feel it doesn't mean it's a fact. That's applying emotional reasoning when we take our feelings as evidence for the truth. If things feel negative, we would assume they are. We don't challenge the validity of these. Again, this is not a panacea. This is part of a bigger whole. It's another tool to be able to work with our thoughts, with our feelings, with our actions, and to understand ourselves in a deeper way. This is all about creating self-awareness, understanding our thoughts, so that we can be more positive and hopeful, healthy and productive people. I already talked about should statements, and blaming, believe it or not, is a thinking trap. When we blame others for our problems, we are not taking personal responsibility and acting like passive victims. So we might hear this a lot in other people. It might be a little harder for us to hear in ourselves, but we're listening for things like, it's not my fault, or they started it, right? Sounds like kids. Or he, she, they never did. Something like that. And you want to listen to that and talk about being able to take personal responsibility, even if that means taking only 1% out of 100%. Moving ourselves to taking more and more personal responsibility will be transformative over the long run. Labeling is you assign judgment to yourself or others based on one negative occurrence or incident. It's a thinking trap where one characteristic or behavior of oneself or another person, and then you apply it to the person as a whole. It might sound like, I failed the test, therefore I'm a failure, instead of just, I failed this test. I didn't study. I'm going to study harder next time. Or somebody who is frequently late, she is irresponsible or doesn't value other people's time. So instead of just, having a little bit of, some people are challenged by time, right? We want to give the benefit of the doubt. We suddenly assume that they don't care or value other people's time, where really it could be maybe that person has ADHD or whatever it is, why it was late. So we don't want to globalize. And this is also a very helpful tool for people who are dating as well. Let's see what's next. There are many. There's external control fallacy and internal control fallacy. Just briefly, I'm not going to talk too much about them, but the external control fallacy is the belief that a person's life is completely controlled by external factors. Fate has already been decided, and that one doesn't have any choice or initiative. So if we don't believe we have any control in our lives, why would we put effort towards changing? An example of this, somebody lies and cheats on a test, and when they get caught, they act surprised when they get caught, and then the person fails them. That would be an example. Another example is internal control fallacy. This is the belief that a person has complete control of themselves and their surroundings, right? So between internal and external, neither of them are true. The truth lies somewhere in between. The fallacy of fairness. This assumes that all things in life should be applied and measured based on fairness and equality. As we know, life isn't always fair, and we've all heard that before. However, for some people, it has, never really been driven home, and they believe that life can and should, there's that should again, be fair and struggle with the reality. So an example would be about a married couple. So we'll call them Phil and Abby. They're married, and Abby expects Phil to work full time and do household chores because that was modeled by her parents growing up. However, Phil grew up in a home where only one parent worked, and the other manage the household. Abby consistently gets angry, frustrated, and annoyed by what she perceives as Phil, her husband's, indifference to what she considers a mutual responsibility. Tom doesn't get why he both has to work a full day and then work more when he comes home. So this is like going into, it's not fair, right? What is the impact of sort of holding that fairness so closely when really it's, again, all our sense of fairness, like all other notions, is based on our perception of reality, and our perceptions are subjective. And when real life goes against our perceptions about what we believe to be fair, we're going to experience anger, hurt, fear, a sense of rejection, and more. So both in this case, in this relationship, feel that they're being treated unfairly, and the reality is that neither fair nor unfair. Certainly it just is. And of course, in a relationship, they need to learn to navigate for that. Here's a great one. The fallacy of change. This is the thought distortion. Assumes that others should change to suit their own interests, right? I'm sure we can all relate to this. We want others around us to change, and maybe we even try to pressure them to change. We believe that when the other person changes, starts exercising, loses weight, goes to the doctor, starts reading, whatever it may be, they're going to be happy or fulfilled or whatever. And they often believe that their happiness or contentment is dependent on the other person changing. And the truth is the opposite, right? The only people that we can change is ourselves. And as we know, that itself is also difficult. Change is something that happens over time, and we are responsible for changing ourselves and can never, as much as we try, change another person. We can influence, we can support, we can encourage, but not change. Personalization, this thinking trap, is when you blame yourself for something that is not entirely your responsibility. So on the other end, there's like taking responsibility, and this is personalization, where you take responsibility, something outside of your control. For example, your partner, let's say, broke up with you, and you assume all the blame. If only I did everything that they asked, our relationship wouldn't have ended. Really? Is that true? Telling yourself when someone else is struggling, I should have tried harder or done better, and believing that the person is struggling because you didn't do more, right? Really personalizing it. These examples have subjects that feel that the negative things in their lives are connected to them, and they have failed to accept that not all circumstances are within their control, and that everybody is different and responsible for their own lives. And this causes a tremendous amount of suffering, and it can also lead to some codependent behavior as well. So as we sort of, we're nearing towards the end of this live, and I would encourage you to just think about which one or two or maybe more of the thinking traps resonated with you, and how often you fall into that trap, and begin to start becoming aware of the thinking traps in your life. Were you aware before? Right? We can't change anything until we become aware of them. I know that for me, over the course of my life, catastrophic thinking has been a main thinking trap, and I'm very much onto myself. When I do that thinking trap, black and white thinking also, and mind reading. Again, all very normal. Some of this can be very helpful as well, because it can help you prepare for all kinds of things. But general rule of thumb, if you notice that you're activated, you're anxious, right? You want to pause, and one thing to do is ask yourself, okay, what was I thinking, right? Or what just preceded that caused me the anxiety? And we know now that it's all a loop, right? One feeds into the other. And again, like I said, this is not a total panacea, but it's another tool to practice on the journey of emotional regulation and understanding oneself. So if I were to do another live, which I hope to be doing, perhaps I would go deeper and model how we would challenge our thinking traps. It's called challenging thinking traps or cognitive reappraisal. And this is a tool, and I'll just give a brief introduction since I have a few more minutes left. The first thing you do is you identify the situation and check in, rate the strength of your emotion from 1 to 10. You would identify the thought, then identify the thinking trap, and then we'd gently challenge or question the thought, moving into generating alternative responses, thoughts, or possibilities, and then reevaluate. And this is an exercise that is to be done. It can be done when you notice it coming up, if you have that freedom, or at the end of the day. And eventually it would be an exercise that one sort of does naturally. The more one becomes aware of their thinking traps and the impact they have on how they feel and how they behave, you're able to sort of intercept them, challenge them, identify them more. Again, another tool in the toolbox of wellness. And I think that's where I will pause. I hope that you got something and learned something about thinking traps. Maybe you've already heard of thinking traps, again, otherwise known as cognitive distortions. You're more aware of them now and starting to become more aware in your people in your life, maybe your children, and you can teach and talk about, oh, hey, that's a thinking trap. And here's something I can do to challenge that thinking trap and choose a different way. Thank you for spending this time with me.